Hello everyone. So for today's video, what we're going to be looking at is some kind of almost sort of a Shakespearean um, arc for President Richard Nixon. We're going to be looking at in this video kind of some of the high points of his administration. Um, and then we're going to, in the next video, look at his downfall in the Watergate scandal, which provides a conclusion to one of the stranger and definitely more unusual arcs for an American president in American history. Um, Nixon is a complicated figure historically. He's one of those people who, on the one hand, if you were to look at his presidency just purely in terms of some of the things that he accomplished, like in terms of environmental reform, in terms of his foreign policy successes, in lessening Cold War tensions, um, is arguably one of the more successful 20th century presidents in that regard. Yet at the same time, his presidency is characterized by this ever-present kind of unseemliness. Whether we're talking about the methods that he used to cultivate and to exploit class and racial differences, to fragment, or I should say, further fragment the Democratic Party coalition, um, including his infamous Southern strategy that he used to, basically turn parts of the South that had been solidly Democratic into areas that would become solidly Republican, um, or his use of covert methods to do a variety of different things. Using the FBI and its COINTELPRO program to discredit and to disrupt the anti-war and Black Power movements, um, his secret bombing campaign in Cambodia. Um, so there's always this kind of duality with his presidency between these, really just absolutely astonishing accomplishments, and then at the other end, this sort of seediness, this sort of, kind of dishonorableness in many cases that accompanies a lot of this sort of stuff. And so that's sort of, an interesting dynamic of it. For this video, we're going to look primarily, though, at his successes. And the Nixon administration does, in fact, have some pretty notable successes. This is particularly true in the areas of environmental policy and in reducing Cold War tensions in the foreign policy arena. Let's start off with his environmental policy. Basically, by the early 1960s, due to decades of industrial expansion and eventually because of the construction of the interstate highway system, um, much of you not only saw much greater degrees of oil consumption, which in and of itself would prove to have major consequences later in his presidency, and for much of the 70s in the form of the Arab oil crisis. Um, you had massive amounts of pollution in the United States by the 1960s. Many American cities, like Los Angeles and New York and St. Louis, amongst others, were choked by smog that oftentimes was so thick that it practically blotted out the sun. Um, in America's industrial core, in the Ohio River Valley in particular, and the upper Midwest, many of the rivers and streams and lakes had been polluted terribly to the point that many of them were no longer capable of supporting wildlife because of decades of industrial pollution and simply dumping heavy metals and contaminants into streams and lakes and rivers. Um, in some cases, the industrial pollution was so intensive that rivers actually caught fire, as occurred on the Cuyahoga River in near Cleveland in 1969, which was actually not the first time it had caught on fire. It had caught on fire a couple of other instances as well due to heavy, um, basically petrochemical flammable materials being dumped into the river. But the fire on the Cuyahoga River was one of the events that really catalyzed a growing environmental movement. Now, this movement had actually grown up during the 1960s, like many social movements. It gained particular attention following the 1962 publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which illustrated the harmful effects of the pesticide DDT on wildlife. The title itself comes from the fact that the pesticide killed a lot of songbirds um, and therefore produced a silent spring. So the publication of Silent Spring, as well as people becoming more exposed to industrial pollution and the harmful effects that it had, um, really builds this momentum for a new movement. Now, part of that is siphoning off some of the excess energy from the anti war or civil rights movements that gradually dissipates by the early 1970s. But one thing that's notable about the environmental movement is that unlike those other movements, unlike the anti-war movement, unlike the civil rights movement, unlike even the feminist movement, the movement for environmental protection is relatively uncontroversial in the United States during the late 60s and early 70s, and attracts broad bipartisan support from not just activists who have had their energies redirected, but also many mainstream politicians and organizations and groups, ranging from, kind of protectionist groups like the Sierra Club to, hunters groups and conservation clubs and things like that. So it is this very broad movement that does enjoy broad public support. And this is also manifested in popular culture. There's a very famous commercial that's produced around this time period in the early 70s that shows a Native American man in a canoe paddling downstream and seeing pollution left behind. And then there's the close up pan to his face and this single tear going down his eye and everything. And um, it's kind of cheesy, but it worked. Um, and so there's this growing support for environmental protection. There had been some action on this end during the Kennedy and Johnson administration, but not really a lot. But this really picks up momentum um, about midway through Nixon's first term in office in 1970, when the first Earth Day is held in the United States. The Earth Day was the idea a of Senator Gaylord Nelson, and very quickly attracted attention nationwide, and ultimately more than 20 million Americans participated in Earth Day activities when it was first launched in April 1970. So this is an idea that had broad popular support, and for that reason, perhaps more than anything else, Nixon ultimately throws his support behind it. That same year, in 1970, Nixon issues an executive order that leads to the creation of the Environmental Protective Agency to regulate the environment and to curb environmental pollution. A few years later, Congress joins in on this action. Again, after much public debate about this and much public pressure, Congress passes two major laws. In 1972, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, both of which are sought to reduce industrial pollutions and emissions, and both of which are very important in cleaning up both the skies and the streams in the United States. The following year, arguably the most well known and highly visible piece of environmental regulation in the U.S. in the latter 20th century is passed in the form of the Endangered Species Act. And one of the reasons why the Endangered Species Act was passed was to protect a nation's symbol, the bald eagle, which due to habitat loss, poaching, and environmental degradation of places where it hunts and eats, was endangered. So the Endangered Species Act is passed in 1973, and so Nixon has this pretty strong record on environmental policy. And it's worth noting that at the time this was thoroughly bipartisan. There wasn't really a lot of organized opposition to environmental policy at this point. What opposition did exist was more dictated by region than it was by party, with a lot of people from the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma, many of whom at this point are still Democrats, opposing it, than Northeastern Republicans and whatnot. So it's not a partisan issue at this point. It will become more of a partisan issue later in the decade, mostly because of things that occurred during the Carter administration. But in the early 1970s, the environmental movement enjoyed broad bipartisan public support and was supported pretty strongly by politicians in both political parties. So that's one of those issues that, again, has today become intensely politicized and intensely partisan in nature, that did not start out that way, at least initially. So moving on, beyond environmental policy, another area that Nixon enjoys strong success is in the area of foreign relations. Now, he did generate some pretty considerable controversies because of his Vietnam War actions, his secret bombing of Cambodia, the invasion of Cambodia the following year. But it's worth mentioning and it's worth pointing out that for Nixon and for his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they generally regarded Vietnam as an unwanted distraction from their larger objective of pursuing a strategy of relaxation or détente with the Soviet Union and China. Nixon and Kissinger were believers in something known as realpolitik, which is this idea that you make policy based on pragmatism and kind of realistic expectations rather than on ideology. And so basically both Kissinger and Nixon reject the Cold War consensus, this sort of simplified idea of, the communist world and the non-communist world, this sort of bipolar construction of the world that had dominated American foreign policy thinking since the Truman administration. By the late 1960s, really actually by the time of the Kennedy assassination, many more sophisticated American policy thinkers were recognizing that there was, in fact, a pretty significant difference within the communist world, and there were, in fact, pretty significant divisions. By the late 1960s, those tensions had become pretty serious, a kind of Cold War within a Cold War between the two big power blocs, the Soviet Union and Communist China. And so basically, what Nixon and Kissinger's idea was, well, these two, you have this kind of Cold War within a Cold War. And so what we're going to do, we're going to lessen tensions and, de-escalate the Cold War a bit by playing these two off against one another and getting concessions from both. That was basically the idea behind the strategy. To that end, in 1971, Henry Kissinger begins reaching out to the Chinese government, to Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, to kind of build a bridge between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, a country that the U.S. had not recognized in any capacity since its founding in 1949 in the Chinese Revolution, Chinese Civil War, that is. So Enlai and Kissinger make some headway in this. That same year, a American table tennis team um, becomes the first American official delegation of any kind to set foot on Chinese soil since the 1949 revolution, something which has been immortalized in popular culture as ping pong diplomacy, and which is the subject of a very funny scene in the 1994 movie Forrest Gump. Um, Actually did happen. But this kind of paves the way for this breakthrough and this kind of slow building of trust. And so the following year, in February of 1972, because of this, kind of under the table diplomacy, and these kind of very high visibility goodwill gestures like this ping pong diplomacy thing, Nixon visits China. He tours the Great Wall of China, where he makes the rather obvious observation: this really is a Great Wall, and he shakes the hand of Mao Zedong, and he's photographed eating Chinese food with chopsticks, and it's really a show designed for the media, who absolutely eat it up, and it doesn't result in any permanent breakthroughs at that moment between the United States and China. It wouldn't be, in fact, until 1979 that the United States would grant full official recognition to the People's Republic of China and begin, having an ambassador there. But it is the beginning of a thawing of relations between the U.S. and China that eventually will become a very important relationship for the United States. Obviously, one that will have some rather significant unintended consequences in the 21st century. But in the context of 1972, it's seen as very beneficial for the United States. It's criticized widely in the United States at the time by many members of Nixon's own right wing of his own Republican Party, like California Governor and future President Ronald Reagan. Um, it's worth noting that a big part of the reason why Nixon is able to get away with doing what he does in China is because he's a conservative Republican with a strong reputation as a strident and hardline anti-communist. He had built his entire political persona from the outset in this sort of staunch anti-communism. And so that gives him a certain degree of political leeway that might not have existed for a Democratic politician in a similar position. So that helps him to an extent and helps, kind of mitigate the criticisms that he receives from those on his political right within his own party. Um, but beyond that, beyond the fact that Nixon's anti-communist bona fides help him, kind of downplay the criticisms of this, um, it proves to have massive dividends in terms of breaking through with America's principal adversary in the Cold War, the Soviet Union. Um, the Soviet Union and the United States had actually been engaged in talks since 1969 to try to reduce their country's respective nuclear stockpiles, to engage in arms reduction, something which had kind of begun during the Kennedy administration, but then had stalled following Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union, Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, engage in talks about freezing the total number of nuclear weapons in their arsenal. With news of Nixon's visit to China, the Soviets kind of get nervous that now they're making headway with the Chinese, and that could put us in a position of danger. And so very quickly, a summit is held in Moscow between President Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, and eventually a strategic arms limitation treaty, or SALT treaty, is signed, in which both countries agree to freeze their nuclear stockpiles for a certain amount of time. Um, this treaty proved to have fairly limited effect because of new types of weapons that were developing at the time that were not included in the treaty, but it was still a pretty big start. That same year, an even more significant treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty is signed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And what the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM treaty, does is it basically is an agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that neither country would attempt to build a missile shield, a basically like a missile defense system that would enable them to shoot down any incoming ICBMs coming from the other country. Now, this is something that sounds somewhat counterintuitive. Why wouldn't you want your country to have this to protect itself? Well, the idea was basically that it would leave both countries vulnerable. And by doing so, it would disincentivize either country from launching another arms race or potentially launching a first strike of their own if they felt immune from retaliation. So that's the basic idea behind it, behind the ABM treaty. So that's another big breakthrough, and it ultimately, the process of detente and negotiation with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the decreasing of tensions would actually continue after Nixon's presidency, during the presidencies of both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, though they would eventually break down in 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But that's a topic for another video. So Nixon achieved some pretty remarkable successes in foreign policy. There are some areas that are pretty dark in this arena. In 1973, at the same time that Nixon is engaging in detente with the Soviet Union, the CIA helps back a coup in Latin America, in Chile, against the democratically elected government there under Salvador Allende. Ironically enough, a coup launched on September 11th, 1973, that results in Allende being overthrown and killed, and a military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet being put in place that would last for 17 years, and which would ultimately result in thousands being killed, detained, and tortured. So definitely one of the dark spots on the Nixon legacy. But again, overall, as Nixon was heading into the 1972 election, he had a pretty solid record to run on. His approval ratings were very high, and he definitely achieved some pretty remarkable things. Yet ultimately, because of his own intense paranoia, his own intense desire for secrecy, which had helped him win success in some of these areas, like in foreign policy, this would ultimately bring about his own downfall in rather spectacular fashion with the Watergate scandal. And so the story of the election of 1972 and the Watergate scandal will be the subject of our next video.